Knight has to be one of those great untapped gems in all comic book history. He's had a lot of great individual stories and even some very good extended stories, but he's never had the popularity or respect I think he deserves. So who or what is Moon Knight? Well, it's a little difficult to tell because he began in the pages of Werewolf by Night, and honestly, he seemed a little incoherent, going back and forth between being a hero and a villain. Canonically, essentially, Moon Knight was a mercenary who believed he was saved by God and became this very religious superhero who decided to fight for the forces of good. In terms of his mental background, the show is presenting him as having two personalities, but in the comics, he really has three personalities that he goes between. But some of this is done for investigative work, so it's not clear it's a mental issue as much as just a part of his pragmatic crime fighting. On the surface, of course, Moon Knight has often been labeled a Batman clone, but substantively their origins are very radically different, right? Mark becomes Moon Knight as an adult. Bruce got traumatized as a child. There is a similarity in that they both face trauma, but really Moon Knight from his first appearances, sort of not really a hero. They have to work out just how heroic Mark is. Keeps fluctuating story to story. Now I know Moon Knight mainly from the 1990s, and in fact, probably the first time I really noticed him was in Infinity Gauntlet, where he makes a very short cameo, but he left quite an impression. And I followed him a lot in both his book as well as his team-ups. And I have to be honest, the best Moon Knight stories tended to be the team-ups with him and Spider-Man and or the Punisher. And I'd highly recommend Round Robin. That's a spectacular 1990 story. And he also had a great little story, him teaming up with Spider-Man and the Punisher. It also lays out nicely philosophically where he stands, because he's sort of in between Spider-Man and Punisher. He's not as fixated on the no-kill rule that Spider-Man has to never take any kind of life, innocent or guilty. So he is much closer to the Punisher, willing to use some deadly force at times, but he's not going to do it as much as the Punisher or with as much ease. Right? He has a very different background. He has a wife, he has an assistant, a pilot who helps him. So he has aspects of the Batman mythology, but it's very, very much its own thing. Even the costume, when it first appeared, is nowhere close to Batman. It's very much its own distinct flavor. He doesn't even have a cape. But again, you can't deny that, especially with the show, they are taking the structure of the Batman mythology, but twisting a little bit. So, in the comic, yes, Moon Knight does suffer from personality disorder, but the stories I read him, he seemed to be mainly in control. Here, however, in the first episode, it's a little bit more jumbled. Essentially, we're getting Mark being changed from an American to British, although again, it's, I think, unreliable narration, so we're going to have to wait and see. And he seems to be just a lowly worker at a museum, but in reality, he's caught up in a mix of extraordinary events. And the narrative is a little jumpy, switching between past and future. So when we're in the narrative, it seems we're in the present, but really we're in a different timeline. So that was, I think, a little needlessly confusing. You pick up soon enough what is going on, namely that one, he's faced in a weird situation, he blacks out, a more dominant personality takes over, and that person really is Moon Knight and is able to take care of business. And his main antagonist, at least for episode 1, is this weird religious figure. I think that's really the standout. Ethan Hawke was very effective as this creepy kind of religious cult leader, and how he's going to challenge Moon Knight, and how he's serving a sort of Egyptian deity of his own and has his own agenda. And a lot of people pointed out it seems a plot hole that Moon Knight is just let go. But again, these kinds of characters are really hard to understand because their motivations are not as simple as just profit or power, right? They do believe in destiny, and it appears that Mark is a part of this destiny, but what is the exact role? Unclear. So the episode itself, I would rate above average. I'd give it a solid 7 out of 10. Still a lot of questions. And again, I do give them credit. They're not doing this typical MCU formula. They do have some humor and some jokes, but it's dry. It's very British flavor. I think Oscar Isaac is amazing as always, bringing the physicality as well as the humor to the role, but it's not overdone. The really awful stuff is with the CGI that looks very amateurish. It's also very constrained. Even though they used a lot of locations, it feels very claustrophobic. So they're not really taking advantage fully of the locations. You do have some lingering questions of how miraculously Mark is speaking essentially to God, and why God at certain moments talks, why he talks the way he does. I felt the voice acting was really annoying, frankly. It bugged me personally, but it may work for others. Beyond that, it was mainly a solid introduction to the character, though I think really Moon Knight as Moon Knight only emerges literally in the last couple of seconds. So it's a little disappointing waiting for so long for Moon Knight to actually emerge, and I would have preferred they just start off with Moon Knight already fully formed. He's going on missions, and we learn the backstory slowly through flashbacks. I think that would have been much more entertaining and much more pleasing. But I give them respect for at least trying to stay consistent with the dark tone and the kind of supernatural vibe, which Moon Knight did have. But again, he also had a very noir, a very science fiction background too. I mean, he takes on androids and secret societies, so it's really hard to pin down an essential Moon Knight. He's been flexible throughout his years, both in terms of his costume, his origin, as well as his disposition, because sometimes he can be very, very brutal and ruthless and just pull out nunchucks and be merciless against enemies. But other times he can show a lot of compassion and be very thoughtful. He's extremely clever, which is what I really liked about Round Robin. He is not like Batman, who can just take on much stronger opponents and miraculously win all the time. That doesn't happen. He's very limited sometimes because he is still human. He has some, quote, abilities, but he is still limited. He has to use his mind a lot in order to win, and he usually does. But again, it's a very different focus on the character. So I hope they do more than just superficial callbacks. Apparently, there's really only very small references to the comics. For instance, there is a reference to the Werewolf by Night comic, like a QR code, which is not very much, I think, or substantive. So they are tying it to the comics, but it's fairly thin. So I think if you don't know Moon Knight from the comics, unfortunately, you're probably going to get the most out of this. But if you do know the comics, you are wondering why so much of the supporting cast is gone, why so many details were needlessly changed. And again, this is essentially a New York City character. That's really his main base of operations, but they just totally changed that. Again, it's unreliable narration. We're going to have to see how much of what we see is who Mark and or Steve Grant is. A lot of this could just be misdirection. So it's off to a good start. It is an above average episode. I would recommend it. It's very intriguing, and at least it's not following the same formula as the other MCU shows, which I thought were okay, but definitely fell into a certain pattern, which I found annoying. So hopefully this is going to buck the trend. So a good episode and a good start, but I do hope they tie it much more strongly to the comics, which have a lot of excellent stories, which they can tap into, and hopefully will expand, I think, a very small and dedicated fan base that realizes this is much more than a Batman clone, but a very intriguing character in its own right, with a very interesting synthesis of religious mythology and the usual superhero origin story.